Today, our session is on Buddhist sexual ethics with Ayya Soma. And I must say, this is a very rarely talked about topic, but also very interesting. So, what is considered sexual misconduct as taught by the Buddha? And what should we keep in mind when adapting those teachings to modern living, especially as a lay person? So, before we start, a little bit about Ayya Soma. She's an Italian Buddhist monk and co-abbot of Empty Cloud Monastery in New Jersey. A former fashion and lifestyle editor, her first encounter with Buddhism monasticism was at Santa Chitarama Monastery in Italy in the tradition of Ajahn Chah. She started practicing as a renunciant in 2016, receiving monastic ordination in 2018 and through full bhikkhuni ordination in 2020. As the co-founder of Buddhist Insight, a non-for-profit organization connecting people with monastics, she has learned the Dharma through perspective of monks of all different traditions like Bhante Sudaso, Bhikkhu Bodhi, Ajahn Pansano, Van Robina, Quarton, Ajahn Brahm, and a lot of many teachers. And Ayya Soma also gave a teaching at a Metta convention this weekend. So if you're interested, check it out as well. You can always visit the link in our YouTube channel. As always, this will be an interactive session. I will start with the introduction, bit of meditation, and then Tina will jump in to facilitate the talk. If you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to pop them in the chat. And if you don't feel comfortable sharing them with everyone, you could also send the question privately to Tina. This session will be recorded and uploaded on YouTube. And without further ado, over to you, Ayya.
Right, well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you, Tina, for inviting me, as well as Sinsin for setting up all of these different meetings. So 1 second that I remove my face from the screen because it's highly distracting for myself. So, okay, great. All right, we can get into a comfortable seated position. If you're not seated already, please take a comfortable seat. And when you're ready, you can close your eyes, take a few deep breaths. And just relax the entire body from the top of the head to the tip of the toes. Enjoying this moment of stillness, of silence. With nothing to do, nowhere to go, nothing to think about. We can allow ourselves to just be. Whatever things feel like, we just let them be the way they are. Whatever sounds we hear, just let them be. Without wanting anything to be different than what it is. And just allow ourselves to stay here in the present moment. We can enjoy these few more moments of idleness. And we're just being, allowing ourselves, just staying in the present moment. And wishing for ourselves to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Bringing this thought to the mind, recollecting the purpose of all our Buddhist practices. Wishing for ourselves to be unconditionally happy. For our benefit and the benefit of all sentient beings. We can slowly come out of formal meditation and open our eyes and say 3 sadhus. Sadhu,
Sadhu,
sadhu. Good to see you all friends on the other side of the world. Greetings from Italy. So before we begin our session, we can start by paying homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, the reason why we're all gathered here today. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammam sangham namasami. Right, well, welcome friends. So today the topic is sexual ethics in Buddhism. And before we begin, it's very important to remember that there's a bit of a difference between what we perhaps find in different Buddhist countries, what we talk about as perhaps sometimes as Buddhist culture, sometimes as Buddhist customs, sometimes as Buddhist tradition, and what on the other hand, we find in the text, what are exactly the teachings of the Buddha in terms of sexual conduct and also sexual misconduct. So of course, in the suttas, we, for the, us monastics, we keep it very simple. And so there's just no sex. No sex, no problems. So obviously, the practice of celibacy is something that is not optional, definitely in Theravada Buddhism, also in Mahayana Buddhism, except that obviously there's also different forms within Mahayana Buddhism and Vajrayana Buddhism that instead are not Vinaya-based. So there are certain orders of practitioners that might look like monastics as a form, but actually it's a sort of semi-monastic form that whoever practices in that tradition can understand, can distinguish. And sometimes people who are not part of that tradition can get a little bit confused, especially in the Tibetan tradition. A lot of the lamas, of the rinpoches seem like fully ordained monastics, but actually they're lay people that wear robes. And so in that case, when usually we have those forms that are not sort of determined by the monastic vows that we take, then in those situations, the practitioners can actually engage in sexual conduct. And so what we're going to discuss today a little bit also kind of applies for those folks as well. So whoever essentially is not taking on the practices of celibacy, which is basically everyone except fully ordained monastics or novices, it's very important to understand what we're talking about when we say sexual misconduct first and foremost. So that's actually how the Buddha talks about it throughout the suttas, or at least how the Buddha is reported to be talking about it in the suttas. So that is Kame Sumichachara Veramani Sikapadam Samadhiyami, right? And that literally just means I will restrain myself from doing any type of sexual misconduct. Throughout the suttas, we see that is described generally actually in the male form. So even though it applies for everyone, regardless of both sex and gender, throughout the suttas, we actually find something, a sort of very kind of straightforward definition that only seems to apply to one particular group of people. And usually, actually, I have the quote here that we see in the suttas. So I'm going to be reading from Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. It says, he misconducts himself in sensual pleasures. He has intercourse with women who are protected by their mother and father, brother, sister, or relatives, who have a husband who are protected by law, and even with those who are garlanded in token of betrothal. So if someone is a straight man, this might be quite straightforward what sexual misconduct essentially entails. But if someone, for example, is even a straight woman, right, then there can be the sort of sense, the idea that actually, well, as long as you don't have intercourse with women, then there's no sexual misconduct. Of course, this is not the case. And we see actually within Buddhist culture that is quite understood that pretty much the sort of opposite of this applies for women. So obviously, if a woman, straight woman, has intercourse with men who are protected by their mother and father, brother, sister, relatives, or who have a wife who are protected by law, and even with those who, well, maybe the last one doesn't apply to most people in the world anyway, regardless of gender, or garlanded and token of betrothal. But rather, it seems like it's quite straightforward, right, to do the parallel for women, and that's how it should be applied. But the reason why I'm also bringing this up, the fact that actually throughout the suttas, there is not one sort of instance that I'm aware of where we actually see this definition of misconduct explicitly laid out for quote unquote straight women. It gives us a sense of how we should take the definition of sexual misconduct. Which is not literal sometimes, but actually rather something that gives us a sense of what is the principle, essentially. So we see in other parts of the suttas, when right action is defined, it's defined as abstinence from the destruction of life, abstinence from taking what is not given, and abstinence from sexual misconduct. Of course, every action that we do in Buddhism is inspired by right intention, right? And so what is the intention that we should be cultivating in everything that we do? The intention of renunciation, the intention of non-ill will, the intention of harmlessness. So essentially our actions, so when we're talking about sexual conduct, any sexual conduct that we do should be based on an intention of renunciation, an intention of non-ill will, and an intention of harmlessness. Those are the core values. And we see that in the sort of definition then of sexual misconduct that we find the suttas, it's quite embodied in there, right? There is obviously both the intention of renunciation. So of course, usually when we
I think Aya's just having some technical difficulties on her side. Perhaps it's just to do with her internet. So we'll just wait for her as she reconnects. So Aya, we just lost you for a little bit. I think the internet's quite unstable over there. Yep.
Oh, sorry about that. Can
That's
you
okay.
hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. So where did you lose me at?
I think probably the last 2 minutes.
Okay, so did you hear me about right intention, right action? Yes?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so as I was saying, so essentially any right action that we do has to be based on right intention, which, as we were saying, is once again the intention of renunciation, the intention of non-ill will, and the intention of harmlessness. So when we see the definition of not engaging in sexual misconduct, we see that essentially all of these three values are pretty much embedded in that. So obviously the most kind of common case of sexual misconduct is adultery, so cheating on one's partner. So of course, when one refrains from doing that, essentially they're acting upon an intention of renunciation. So if there is if we have an attraction for someone else, well, we renounce that attraction for that other person and we stick to the commitment that we have. So there's the intention also of non-ill will and and of harmlessness, right? We don't want to harm the person that we are in a relationship with. And also, we don't want essentially to hurt anyone, for anyone to have basically a bad sort of emotional experience, whether we're in a relationship with them or not. So, of course, if someone is dependent on parents, if someone is a minor, there are some legal sort of limitations. If we're in a position of power, this is usually the terminology that we use these days in the West. If we are in that kind of position, obviously there is some harm that is going to be done. There is going to be people who will be suffering, right, in that context. So we kind of understand the underlying principles of essentially what governs non-indulging in sexual misconduct, right? And these should be these principles, because that's essentially what everything that the Buddha taught is, principles, rather than you should be doing this or you shouldn't be doing that based on arbitrary reasons because he says so. But rather, the Buddha essentially encourages us to really understand what are the implications of our actions and what are the principles that should be governing our actions. And my understanding is that that's why actually it is not expressed so much in details in all the different variants. There is, of course, a historical reason, perhaps the way that the texts have been kind of passed on, but there's also just not a particular, there's kind of like more throughout the suttas, there is never the Buddha that talks about someone in Italy, for example, right now, or someone in Australia, right? So there's usually what is spoken about is always about folks living in India. So if we can get very literal about things, oh, well, the Buddha is speaking only about people and groups of people in India, well, then it doesn't apply to me, it doesn't apply to you all. You can just go home. These texts don't speak to me. And so if we approach the text, the Buddhist text, with that kind of idea, I'm not a straight man, so this kind of definition doesn't apply to me, then we can get a little bit we're kind of missing the point. So it's very important with everything that we encounter to really do this work of trying to understand the underlying principles. And then that way we can extrapolate, of course, maybe the relationship, as we were saying, of women, straight women within a sort of straight relationship, which it would be essentially the mirror of the definition that we see in the suttas. And then we can also understand other types of relationships that can happen, which fundamentally my understanding is that it's no different than actually a lot of the modern sort of understandings that we have of relationships in the West that people have been fighting actually through civil rights. And
They're just waiting for Ayya again.
can you hear me now?
Yeah, so we got up to civil rights.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. It must be, I'm at my parents' home. I'm having some teenage flashbacks of my previous life within this life. And there was no internet in my previous life within this life when I was living here. So maybe that's what's happening. Anyway, so I feel that actually, it has taken quite some time for us in the West to actually get to an understanding of through the laws that we have, sort of protection for people to actually be in relationships that fundamentally do not harm the whole of society. And that has been a process of actually separating the religious from the secular. So the idea, for example, the criminalization of homosexuality, for example, or any type of gender expression, historically has been dictated by the idea that we have in the West of what is appropriate, what is correct sexual conduct, and what is incorrect sexual conduct. And that is usually based essentially from specific ways of understanding sexuality, which obviously in Abrahamic religions are more, the framework is procreation. So the framework is the only sort of purpose that one should have when having sexual intercourse is for the sake of procreation. This is definitely true for Catholicism. I'm not 100% sure for all the other forms. I was born in a Catholic country, so that was the sort of the principles that I'm most familiar with. But I seem to understand that that's pretty much true for any Abrahamic religion, whether it's Judaism, whether it's Christianity, and whether it's Islam. And as we see that essentially through the process either of colonization or occupation or whatever we want to call it. So when Buddhist countries essentially have turned or have been influenced, have been occupied by different people with this different sort of framework, where obviously any kind of sexual intercourse that wasn't destined for procreation was considered immoral, was considered not to be done. When these principles were sort of brought by people with that kind of worldview going to Asian countries, well, they were quite shocked, actually. So we have many accounts that are actually quite humorous of all the different, humorous and in a way of seeing the perspective of people actually either in the 16th century in Sri Lanka or throughout the centuries in different parts of Asia, including including China and India as well, where whether it was, sort of politicians or whether it was actually priests, they were quite shocked of how essentially there was no criminalization of homosexuality, and there was no emphasis actually on gender expressions to begin with. So what we see today, sometimes actually a lot of folks, even from Sri Lanka actually, they would have very strong ideas on what is proper conduct, proper sexual conduct, and proper ways of handling the third precept, right? And so then we can kind of equate that. We can think that that is the way that Buddhism essentially has materialized throughout the centuries, the message of the Buddha. But actually, that's a very recent introduction in the society. So, for example, the laws against sodomy were introduced, if I remember correctly, at the end of the 19th century in Sri Lanka. And it was a British intervention. And that was also as well as for example, of even a lesbian relationship is something that in Sri Lanka happened in the 1990s. So like less than 30 years ago. So very, very recent. And so this is why it's important to understand, actually, this is a teaching of dependent origination. We see that, of course, there are Buddhist principles in a country, but after 2,500 years after, the passing away of the Buddha, there's also a lot of other different influences, a lot of different causes and conditions that create essentially the result that we're seeing today. And that's why it's important that we don't just copy and paste whatever it's currently present, it's whatever it's given to us. And we say, okay, well, in Sri Lanka, there's this idea that this is sexual misconduct. So everyone who behaves in a way that is not in accordance to these values, these ideas, then everybody else should, conform. But rather, what we should be doing is investigating the teachings of the Buddha and really looking at all of these different relationships. What is there any harm that is being done? Is there any, any sort of problem that are these people harming themselves if they're actually having these relationships that we find that we disapprove on? Or is it just none of our business? So in 99.9% of the cases, it's none of our business. It's usually, actually, it's us that we are actually trying to essentially get people to act and behave in a way that is actually harming them. So then we should be looking at our actions. Then that's when we are actually not following the Noble Eightfold Path, when our intention is not of harmlessness, but rather it gets into the domain of actually harming others, when we're trying to get them, to convince them to essentially copy a sort of form, a framework that has nothing to do with essentially the teachings of the Buddha, has nothing to do with with what is the purpose of practice. And so the only purpose when we're talking about sexuality, the only purpose within Buddhism is, as with every single action, to make sure that we don't harm ourselves and others as we are practitioners. But there is no purpose in terms of procreation. The Buddha was not interested in creating a procreating society. In fact, actually, that's a very fun fact. Historically, we see that Buddhist countries actually are on the lowest of the spectrum of of reproduction. I always find that very humorous. Where you see Abrahamic religions, except for now the Christian countries that now are kind of like keeping up with the Jonases being the Buddhists. But it's for different reasons, which actually are the secularization actually of Christian countries. That's why there's less and less emphasis on reproduction. But instead, when we see, for example, Muslim countries where instead the Abrahamic sort of values are still very, very present, those are usually at the forefront of the numbers of reproduction. And that's because we see those values that are within the religion. And today it's not about saying those values are right or wrong. It's just those are the values of that religion. So when we decide to become Buddhist practitioners, well, it's kind of like bizarre to go and get the values of the Muslims or the Christians or the whoever, or the Hindus or whatnot. We should actually just be doing the research of what are the values within the framework that the Buddha has given to us, because essentially all the Buddha has taught is this is suffering, this is the cause of suffering, this is the end of suffering, and this is the way out of suffering. So everything has to always be within the Four Noble Truths. He says as much throughout the suttas. Everything he taught is just like the footprints of an elephant. Every single footprint of every animal fits within the footprint of an elephant. It's the same with everything that we do in Buddhism. Everything has to fit within the Four Noble Truths. It says the Four Noble Truths are the footprint of the elephant, essentially. And so that's whenever we're confused, whenever we can't find the exact answer in the suttas, I feel it's very useful to bring up this framework and really recollect and ask ourselves, how is this action, how is this behavior helping me move forward in the path? And how am I judging kusala from akusala, essentially? How am I distinguishing what is beneficial from what is not beneficial? What kind of frameworks am I using? Am I taking things from the outside world? So it's very interesting because, you know, we tend to think once again that I also spoke in this talk about, you know, the modern rights that we have in the West. And so we tend to have this idea that actually the modern West is so much more superior than so many different other realms, right? Definitely of the past. But we tend to think of this general past. But actually, when we see the history of Buddhist countries, including actually at the time of the Buddha and the Therigatha, when I gave a talk here as well, I think with the Metta Center, I was sharing how, you know, just by translating the Therigatha, so the verses of the bhikkhunis of the time of the Buddha, of the enlightened bhikkhunis, there's, you know, sometimes we actually have to really face our prejudice, our pre-assumptions, that we kind of tend to think that people had it so much worse back in the day. But is it actually true? You know, there's also these episodes like Sundari that actually receives the inheritance, the Teri Sundari. So 2,500 years ago, in ancient India, apparently women were capable of receiving an inheritance. And this was a modern right of last century in the West. Up until, 100 years ago, well, there was not really any inheritance actually for women. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is that we tend to think that what we currently have is something modern, currently is something superior, currently is the best sort of form of things. But actually, in a lot of ways, we are very well behind. And once again, as I was mentioning before, in pre-colonial Sri Lanka, a lot of these problems weren't a problem. There was no criminalization exactly of homosexuality. There was just not, it was not a question. There were no rights because there was no infringement on the rights of people, so to speak. You know, you need to create protection laws in order to protect a group of people that has been mistreated, right? So the reason why there were no protection laws, paradoxically, is because people weren't mistreated to begin with. You know, it was not a problem. So that's paradoxically, instead we have now in a lot of different Asian countries, we have laws that do precisely the opposite, create problems, infringe on people's rights, because actually it was seen as, back in the day, as something that needed to be acted upon based on Victorian values, based on whatever was the value at the time, which was not a Buddhist value. It was something that it was introduced there. So I feel like these days we can kind of, you know, look, we have an incredible amount of Dhamma available online. Suttacentral.net, what Bhante Sujato has done is just incredible that, you know, at the fingertip, wherever you are in the world, you can actually have access to the teachings of the Buddha. So instead of going by our opinions, instead of going by our ideas, instead of going by our likes and dislikes, which essentially is what in the Kalama Sutta the Buddha tells us to stop doing, not do, rather we can actually go and really do the work of what did the Buddha say, what is in the suttas, and we can start reflecting and asking questions based on that, rather than based on our assumptions or what our neighbor is doing. So anyway, so these are some reflections, and maybe now we can open it up and see if anyone has any questions or comments, and we can discuss from here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ayya. Clearly a lot of research and time has gone into this. So thank you for sharing what you've come across, and it is really eye-opening to hear about this. So I'm going to open up to anyone who has any questions. So for those who are here in person, you can write your questions onto the pieces of paper. For those who are joining us online, you can pop your questions into the chat. You can, of course, also unmute yourself if you feel like asking the question directly. And the people who are here, there's no need to unmute yourself. Go ahead and ask your question. So fire away. So if anyone has any questions for Ayya, who's very well researched and clearly very experienced as well, pop it into the chat and I'll be able to facilitate the questions. So Ayya, are you ready?
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay, so first question. How beneficial is celibacy for lay people?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I would say it's absolutely beneficial for everyone. So that's why we have the 8 precepts, the practice of taking the 8 precepts in Buddhism. Usually we'll do it at least, during the Uposatha, so twice a month, during the full moon and new moon. If you're particularly diligent, maybe you want to do it also during the quarter moons, so once a week. But yeah, once again, it is a practice of self-restraint. So we want to really get good at this practice of renunciation. And so if we are lay people, of course, maybe we're not ready to take the full-on celibacy training that the Buddha has prescribed for monastics, and that's completely okay. It's totally fine. Celibacy, once again, it's not an end of itself. It's a means to an end, actually. And especially in lay practice, we can see how, just abstaining for periods of time can really create those conditions for the practice of renunciation, which then makes us also more empowered to renounce when there is a really strong sort of sexual impulse, when there's a really strong attraction perhaps towards others, which we also have to understand that it's completely kind of normal. It's normal. Like, it's not something that we should be feeling sinful about, or that we're really like horrible human beings. If we hang out actually with animals for a period of time, it's actually really refreshing, because we see how very simple they are in these sort of terms, and also how kind of gross they are too, in other respects. And we can start laughing about it. I think it's good to laugh about also our sort of impulses, which is just nothing but Vedana, really. It's just, either a pleasant feeling or an unpleasant feeling or a neutral feeling. It's just we take it so seriously. We really take it very, very seriously. And when we take it very seriously, we identify with the Vedana, then we act upon the Vedana impulsively because we think it's who we are. But, when we train ourselves to really practice, self-restraint, renouncing, then we kind of start understanding that, Vedana is anatta. Vedana is not self. It's just something that is present, is currently there. And then we have an option whether to act on it or not act upon it. And so the more we practice with precepts, the more we become more skilled at not acting. Helps us with everything that we need to develop really in the behalf, because we become more intentional with what we're doing, rather than kind of being all over the place and, doing some crazy things sometimes and some wholesome things some other times. And, it's kind of like hit or miss, or miss, hit, miss, hit, right? So we want to instead do hit, miss, hit, miss, and then ideally we just hit at the end of the day. So yeah, it's absolutely a highly recommended practice, the practice of celibacy. 5 stars out of 5.
So can you tell us a bit about why it's 5-star out of 5? So what's the benefits of celibacy and what did the Buddha say about it?
Yeah, well, we have this saying in Italy, appetite comes through eating. So, yeah, there is something at the very beginning when we can see it with fasting, water fasting, for example. If any one of you has done water fasting in your life, well, if you haven't, you should try. But at the very beginning, kind of like when you start any type of fast, your mind starts going insane, literally going insane. And like you feel like you're about to die, even though actually physically the sort of body has actually, especially with food, you can stay for over a month, without actually dying. Actually, for a long period of time. I think Jesus did a water fast of like 40 plus days or so. So you can really like last for quite a bit without food. Yet, even after just like less than 24 hours, your mind starts going completely deranged and having all sorts of craving. And so the first 3 days are actually of complete insanity of the mind. And usually people quit the sort of fast somewhat in those like couple of days, right? But if you actually manage to go past that threshold, then all of a sudden, actually, wow, it becomes a really pleasant state of existence, which is why lots of spiritual practitioners indulge in good choice of word, indulge in water fasting. Because you have all of this incredible energy of mind, for example, focus, like you feel so much better. Like there's all of this, wow, it's a really great state of existence. And then interestingly enough, the appetite also stops being present. And if one keeps doing it and then it gets out of a water fast, all of a sudden, actually at the end of the water fast, the mind will stop craving junk food, but rather it craves nutrition. It craves for actual food that is good for the mind, and it's good for the body. And so we kind of reset to kind of like when you reboot the computer. It goes like back to factory mode, and you're like, oh, so much less dukkha. And so that's kind of like what happens essentially with the practice of celibacy. At the very beginning, maybe we might go like completely deranged and have all these sort of different impulses and like, this is crazy, I can't do it. But then after a while, like, well, first and foremost, I have a lot more time in my hands. Right? There's so many more things that I can do. Also, one stops objectifying people, stops relating to people in that kind of like sort of really creepy way, actually, like constantly looking at the potential, of something that one can have, even like in the sort of ways that we can romanticize this very much, like, also in the kind of like most ideal romantic situation, when we talk about, oh yeah, unconditional love, but really the reality is actually we have all these like lengthy lists of like all the things that, the partner should be doing in order to be a good partner, and all the, different mental kind of requests, all the conditions essentially that we put to unconditional love. So if we actually, the practice of celibacy just allows us to put all of this there down, kind of like the meditation that we did this morning when we first met. Sometimes also with meditation, we can get like so stressed out of like, focus, do this, do that, produce this, produce that. How about we just sometimes just allow ourselves just not to do anything? And that is essentially also the practice of precepts. We allow ourselves to just stop obsessing about other, about the people, stop obsessing about all our wants, our cravings, our ideas, stop objectifying ourselves and others. So there's lots of incredible advantages to that. And it's just tied up with what the Buddha talks about over and over again, with simply non-harming, simply renouncing, simply letting go. you know. Obviously, sexual urges are the biggest kind of form of desire that we have. It's the most distinctive. So the more we practice in letting go of the strongest form of desire that we have, the more peace we get, the more very relaxed, you know. It's also great going to, you know, the monastery, I have to say, in our gender inclusive monastery. Yeah, you kind of go straight to the after 7 years of marriage, you know, when there's sacrifices, when you put all of these people together with zero benefits, then yeah, then you're kind of like, okay, yeah, it's kind of dukkha just living together. And yeah, and we stop romanticizing, we stop thinking too much about what we can get from others, and rather just focus on the path, focus on creating wholesome qualities that are really what supports our own well-being and the well-being of others. So yeah, there's lots of good benefits.
Okay, we'll be back in a few seconds. Oh, are you back?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So just so where we're up to now. So thank you, Ayya, for that. And on the topic of celibacy, there's a lot of questions that have come up about this. Clearly people are interested, but also I can imagine it's very different to, of course, what we're brought up with and what society tells us. And so another question, or comment plus question. This person has said, I think celibacy without good meditation, such as jhana, would be difficult. The mind will always be looking for pleasure, but it's just giving up a gross form of pleasure for a more refined form. Any thoughts on that, Ayya?
I would say both. So the practice of celibacy helps us actually to attain good meditation, because obviously, especially when it comes to the jhanas, well, the jhanas are, in order to access the jhanas, essentially there's the absence of the hindrances, and the first hindrances being sensual desire. Obviously, if we're constantly craving for sexuality, it will be very difficult to reach any type of concentration that is decent, let alone the first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana. Forget about that. So that's why, you know, I think we get it all backwards actually in sort of Western Buddhist, you know, us kind of converts get it a little bit all wrong, because we get, you know, into the samadhi part before going through the sila and panya. And instead, historically, we see actually throughout, whether it's Mahayana, Theravada, Vajrayana, everywhere, the biggest solid foundation is sila. And so you need to practice with the precepts in order to create a really good foundation that then it's very good soil where to plant then the seeds essentially of panya, the seeds of samadhi. Otherwise, if you have really terrible soil, good luck with that, you know. It's kind of the problem that we're having in agriculture these days. We have all these like incredible seeds, incredible things, but the soil is deperished, it's malnourished. So it's very difficult. It's very doom and gloom. So actually, conversely, if you have really good, rich soil and you have a crappy seed, you put it there, it has more sort of more of a possibility of flourishing and germinating than the other way around. So absolutely, there has to be a foundation of sila. Then, of course, the more then you practice meditation, and of course, you any type of the Buddha calls, you know, all the jhanas, you know, pleasant abidings. So you're having a really great time. It's also nibbana is the foremost of pleasures, actually, foremost sukha, aside from everything. You know, it's a cessation of suffering, which is why it's like, you know, it's also great. But you need to start developing a taste for that. So first you give up the kind of worldly, more coarse states of pleasure, and then you get a taste of that, and then The more you have good meditation, the least interested you are in going back to the core essential pleasures. It's kind of like once you have cashmere, then you're like, well, the synthetic sort of sweater is kind of crappy. I don't want to go back to that. Give me more cashmere, maybe Angora, you start having a bit of a more refined way of going about things.
Very good. Another comment and question. One teacher once said that the process of craving feels good because craving feels like fire. And once we get what we crave, it's like the cessation of that fire. So what's your take on this? Is the cessation of fire a pleasant feeling? And is it the type of feeling that we get from sexual pleasure?
Well, if craving feels like fire and it's so good, then why don't we just go and walk into the fire and stay there, burn ourselves? So good, so pleasant. Maybe we can be the new offering of the barbecue. So actually we see how distorted our view is. I mean, there is definitely, the Buddha talks about the gratification, the danger, and the escape. So there is obviously gratification and sensual pleasures. Otherwise, we wouldn't be that crazy. Now in Italy, where we really got over the top throughout the centuries with, turning all of these different sensual pleasures and some of the most refined sensual pleasures that are quite gratifying. I used to work in that industry. So there's tons of industry of fashion, you would get lots of very pleasant sort of experiences. And so it would be silly to say that they're not pleasant, because there is actually a pleasant aspect to it. Otherwise, people wouldn't be indulging in it. But are they actually fulfilling? That is the danger. That is what essentially the Buddha invites us to see, to come and see. No, everything by anything, it's inherently unsatisfying. And whenever we put, all our sort of bets, all our money, all our stocks on that, then of course we will be essentially disappointed. We will not be happy. Even in the sort of best ideal scenario, the perfect scenario where everything is perfect, you get the most perfect pasta. I have the most perfect pasta. Cooked right at the right time with, the perfect sauce or the perfect like everything perfect. Still, you just can't eat it nonstop. You will get nauseated. Still, there is just so much that you can do with that. It's just not fulfilling. You can't do that 24/7. I mean, you can do it that 24/7 actually, apparently in some heaven realms where they in fact are having a really good time, the devas. But even that one, you can do that 24/7, but for a period of time. So just those times last for a long time, eons, rather than 1 day, 2 days. But still, that too is subject to end. And we've done that already, by the way. We've had the perfect pasta nonstop, every satisfying every second, every moment. Yet here we are back. So that's essentially what the Buddha is inviting us to see. One of my favorite quotes of the Buddha is actually, whatever gratification there was in this world, I discovered it. He's actually not saying, oh, there's no gratification. Quite the opposite. He says there is a lot of gratification in the world, and I discovered it all. And so that's what actually kind of keeps us also stuck, is that we don't quite fully understand it. And so I tend to use the simile actually of ice cream, in the way that we kind of have vanilla ice cream, then we're not satisfied, so then we're like, okay, let me try and find pistachio ice cream, and then from pistachio ice cream we're like chocolate ice cream, and then whatever. In the United States they also have these like really dodgy like ice creams, like puffy ice cream, neon ice cream, and like there's all these variations, right? And so we get distracted by thinking that we're having something new, But fundamentally, it's always ice cream, right? So this is what the Buddha is talking about. Whatever gratification I found in this world, I discovered it is because he understands that it's all essentially the same thing. So you have ice cream, whatever flavor it is, it's still ice cream. It's the nature of ice cream. So it doesn't matter if it's vanilla ice cream or pistachio ice cream, both have the nature of being impermanent and unsatisfying. And that's why they are inherently dukkha. They're just not something fully 100% great that we can rely ourselves on. And so that's something that we all need to see for ourselves. And the more we see that in everything that we engage in, kind of can see essentially also yeah, so we can go like kind of like forever in trying, going from job to job, or also relationship to relationship, or dress to dress, or like any kind of essentially object, or both material or immaterial. We have the same sort of approach. And yes, it is gratifying to a certain extent, but it's also unsatisfying to a lot of the extent. And actually, there was something that Bhante Sudaso, I remember when I had met him, one of his great Dhamma talks actually pointed it out, which really made a huge difference in my mind, which was something along the lines of, if you really want an object, say I really want whatever, a pearl. So I am unsatisfied because I don't have the pearl. Then I find the pearl, right? I have the pearl here in my hand. I'm like, finally, I'm happy. Because there is, in fact, the happiness of getting the pearl. And so then we tend to think the pearl made me happy, clearly, because now I have the pearl and I'm not happy. But actually, the moment we get the pearl, we stop wanting the pearl because we already have it. So we let go of the wanting of the pearl because we have the pearl. So instead of doing all the effort, all the kind of difficulties to get the pearl, the Buddha is very practical. It's like, instead of doing all of that, why don't you just let go of the wanting of the pearl to begin with? And there you go. And then whatever it is, happiness arises. It's unconditional. Whether you even get the pearl or you don't get the pearl, you are still happy.
Very good. Thank you. Now, we do have more questions about craving and celibacy, but I do want to also go to some other questions in case we run out of time. So moving to multiple partners, Ayya. So interesting to hear so someone has made a comment and question. So interested to hear Ayya's thoughts on people who have multiple partners, dating a few people at a time, even if not technically breaking a precept, or is it? But probably not skillful. Though having said that, the kings in the Buddha's time probably had many, many wives, but probably didn't get censured by the Buddha, ? Any thoughts on this, Ayya?
Yeah, thank you. So polyamory, I would say that technically polyamory goes through the consent. So are the people in the relationship in a consensual relationship? Then no problem. If by polyamory we're talking about lots of people who are actually into this relationship without wanting to be in this relationship, well, it doesn't matter if it's 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, 10 people. It's still misconduct because there's no consent. So once again, it's more, we're focusing on consent and non-harming rather than numbers of people or how they are behaving sexually, etc. What kind of sexual intercourse they're having. That is none of our business, or their business. Like, it's no one's business. But it's all on the values of non-harming and consent, essentially. Are the people capable of expressing their consent? Are they in the situation where they know what they're doing, what they're engaging in, and are they willingly and helpingly getting into this relationship? Then no problem, all good. In terms of jumping from one relationship to the other relationship, or whether it's one person or multiple people, I would say yes, it's technically not breaching of the precepts, but probably it will kind of create conditions for greed to sort of accumulate in the mind in the way that it's a little bit what we're talking about with ice cream, that's usually what it is. They're like, all right, blonde person, unsatisfying. Let me see with the brunette person. Okay, brunette person, unsatisfying. Let me see with the redhead person, and it can go. Some Samsara is quite. There's lots of different iterations. So yeah, I feel like, of course, that's just the practice of greed. But as long as the people are consenting, then it is what it is.
Yeah, and probably related to what you were just saying, and particularly about no harm. So the person has said, technically it doesn't break the precept, but if the open relationship leads to jealousy, tension, etc., that it causes some suffering, although it's unintentional. Perhaps it comes down to sampajana, situational awareness of how our action might have impacted others negatively. Any thoughts on that, Ayya?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. But I would say that can happen in also monogamous relationships in sort of just different contexts. Once again, we want to look at the substance, not at the aspect of the surface of things. So we tend to get caught up in the details rather than in what is the underlying problem. And the underlying problem is, once again, jealousy, craving, all the sort of issues that we experience. I mean, even in non-sexual relationships. So envy, there's actually in the where is it? There's Sutta, I can't remember. But anyway, there's this sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya where actually there are all these really hilarious kind of situations where there's the monk that thinks, may I be the one giving the Anumodana today, not the other ones. May I have that gift, not the other monks, So it's essentially, that's the human condition. These are all the defilements that we're trying to work with. And we shouldn't be ashamed of them. We should just be recognizing how this is just the deluded mind. And so we recognize these defilements and we're like, okay, these are dependently arisen from what? What are the actions that create this result, this stain in the mind? And how do I then, instead of preoccupying myself with so much with this result, how about I look at what are the conditions that I can do right now to put in place to get another result where I'm like happy, rejoicing in the happiness of others, where I am wishing for them to be happy, right? So where I'm cultivating, will I have the Brahma Viharas as a result? So the divine dwellings rather than the infernal dwellings of mine, which is jealousy and and all of the sorts.
I love that, infernal dwelling. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, it's infernal. We just had actually this lovely teenage boy. He's 19 years old. He took Samanera ordination at Empty Cloud, Samanera Vadda. And he has all these like perfect karmic conditions. And so he, there's different ways that one can relate to that, either with like, oh, may I be, like 19 years old, may I have all of these great conditions? Or one can go like, good for him. And actually I did a whole like good for him meditation session. It was my favorite mudita practice. So I was like, oh, this is such a great divine dwelling. Why do we ever pick the infernal dwelling, right? So that's what we should always think about whenever we are having thoughts of hatred, thoughts of envy, thoughts of jealousy, or like, oh, I am dwelling in an infernal abode.
Wonderful, thank you. So I, again, talking about not causing harm, this is the question. I wonder how, or is it possible to avoid causing harm to a partner when ordaining? How we can tell we are at that stage where we are nearing going forth and not get anyone in and not get involved with anyone.
Thank you for that question. Well, I mean, ordination is actually one of the kindest things that one can do to the entire world, including oneself. So I would say that it's definitely 100% non-harming. When we talk about it in terms of harming, it's more that obviously the person usually doesn't want for them to, one second, that my mom is here. One second. Mamma sta facendo
You can tell this is live, everyone. You can't make this stuff up.
So I'm back to
Aya's mom. Can we say hi to your mom?
Better late. She's going. I knew this was going to happen.
I love it. It's authentic.
Yeah, definitely.
We could not script this any better.
So as I was saying, she says hello to everyone.
Hi, Mom.
So here I am.
Here you are. Welcome back.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. No problem. So we very much got distracted by your mum, which was lovely. So after that, we didn't really hear anything else. So perhaps we can start again. So again, the question was about going forth and doing that in a way that doesn't cause harm to anyone. And you were saying something very inspiring about how going forth is one of the best things that you can do for yourself and others. So please take it away.
Yeah, exactly. Once again, that was also the example that we see from the Buddha and from countless Theras and Theris. So also in the Therigatha, a lot of the Theris actually in their poems talk about leaving their entire family behind. So yeah, you know, sometimes in Buddhism, actually, we have this kind of, well, actually in Buddhism, Western Buddhism, I would say, some people talk about, you know, the Buddha being, I think you say in English, deadbeat parent or something that leaves everything behind and focus very much on the poor woman. Actually, well, there were lots of deadbeat parents in the Theris as well. And also, yeah, just like a lot of the women were leaving all their families behind. And so it's this understanding that this spiritual life, if one takes it for the right sort of aspiration, not as a form of livelihood, but rather as a form of liberation, then it's actually the best gift that one can give to themselves and others. And it's not about leaving one's responsibilities or breaking hearts because, you know, one can't take it anymore. So not out of like how normally we break relationships, not normally how we kind of try to get out of our responsibilities, but really instead out of that aspiration, understanding the precariousness that we have as human beings, that we're all subject to old age, sickness, and death. And when we understand that no matter how much we can love a person, that we will never be capable of really saving them or helping them or, you know, removing suffering from them, right? Like, for example, my parents now have lots of illnesses, lots of aches due to old age. They're all in their 80s. And I would love to remove all of that suffering from them. If only I could take it, have it on my shoulders, but it's impossible. It's not something that is here available to me. So it's the same with relationships. When whatever kind of relationship, we get to that point where we understand really dukkha, what the Buddha is talking about in terms of dukkha. And we decide to ordain because of understanding dukkha, and that there's only one escape from dukkha, which is the teachings of the Buddha, the Noble Eightfold Path, that full maturation of it. Then I think it's the best, the most ideal sort of way of that. It's pure harmlessness. It's pure benefit, actually. It goes harmlessness. It's the most we're inclined towards this path. If that's why we're inclined towards taking these vows. And if that's the case, if that's our inclination, then by all means go forth, and by all means recollect your own goodness of going forth. So I hope that helps.
Sadhu. So if anyone wishes to go forth, you have our blessings, huh? Wonderful. So another really good question from the audience. I love the idea of coming back to principles of precepts rather than taking them word for word. Often I feel like precepts can become sources of guilt or regret or overthinking that may be unjustified. Could you please talk about how to have a relationship with precepts so it's helpful rather than hindering? And I'll add to that, how to have a relationship while being supported by the precepts and following the precepts.
Great, all good questions, thank you. Well, actually, there are countless sort of parts in the canon where we see where either the Buddha talks about, essentially breaking the precepts, and not himself, but like the process of it, and or practitioners that have done some sort of misconduct. And what is encouraged is essentially to take acknowledge the fact that one has broken the precept, and then move forward. That's it. Understanding, okay, well, I broke this precept, I'm going to reap the results of this karma. There's no way, nothing I can do really to actually wash away this karma. So that we acknowledge, but it's already done. You can't do anything. You can't go back in the past and do something else. All you can do is establish yourself again in the precepts, in the practice of precepts, and do your best to hold the precepts. It's as simple as that. That's also in the monastic form, actually. Aside from obviously the parajika rules, that if we break, those are the expulsion rules, and then there's no returning. We just stop being a monastic. But every other precept that we have, if we break it, it's very simple. We confess it to one of other monastics, and that's it. And then the other monastic asks us, do you see your offense? And you're like, yes. Do you commit to reestablishing yourself in the precepts? And you say, yes, perfect. And then you move forward. That's it. There's no like, oh, you did this, you broke that precept 2 weeks ago. Oh, bad person. No. You put it behind, that's all. But it's very important to acknowledge it, because usually we either like pretend, they're kind of like, oh, never happened, whatever. And that's unskillful. Or we beat ourselves on the back. And that actually creates a sense of identification. That is what in the Sabbatava Sutta, the Buddha encourages us not to do. Which is basically, who was I in the past, what I did, all that storytelling creates this stronger sense of identity. So I am whatever person, I am the killer, I am the one who does sexual misconduct, I am the one who I am the liar, I am, right? No, I lied. Okay, there were lies that were said. Now I will stop lying. As simple as that. Okay, move forward, right? Or in the past, I did sexual misconduct. Now I don't do that anymore. In this moment, there's no sexual misconduct. So we reestablish ourselves in the precepts. And that is incredible. It's just really beautiful. Because then we actually start creating a new form, new actually self-identity. that, because we sometimes then tend to throw away all the identities altogether, but actually we want to kind of start building a new, beautiful, holy identity. And we recollect actually all the good actions that we do. Like, for example, during all this Dhamma talk, we haven't killed anyone. It's incredible. Good. Well done, Ayya Soma. It's beautiful. Haven't stolen anything during this Dhamma talk. Well done. Haven't done any sexual misconduct. Well done. Haven't lied. Well done. Haven't used any intoxicants. Well done. Great, 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 great. And actually, that is Silanusati. It's a meditation practice. We always talk about Anapanasati, we talk about Maranusati, we talk about all sorts of like different Anusati, but why don't we talk more about Silanusati? Like, great. Yeah, I'm such a great person. And so that really delights the mind, and we get a good appetite, actually. So as we were saying, appetite comes through eating. Well, let's eat the right good stuff. And this is something that we need to actually create an appetite for and nourish ourselves and really like feel good about ourselves and being, people who have good sila. It's great. And I can't remember the other part of the question, if there was another part that I missed.
Yeah, so it's about how to use the precepts as a way to have a good relationship.
Oh, like with another person.
Yeah.
I mean, all the precepts are designed essentially to get us to be good people that and other people like. So I mean, it's and you'll see that inevitably you'll have a good relationship. It kind of comes. Yeah, it's kind of like the recipe to make a cake. If you follow the recipe, you'll have a cake. So inevitably, we can see also for ourselves, do we want to be with someone who cheats on us or like, does sexual misconduct? Absolutely not. So if they follow the precepts, that's win-win. Do we want to be with someone who steals? I don't think so. So if we steal, then the other person won't really want to be with us. It's more pleasant. Do we want to be with someone who lies and so forth, or someone who uses intoxicants? All of that just kind of, it's really straightforward, I would say.
Wonderful. Okay, so I note the time. Thank you so much for just spending your time with us, despite you traveling to a different country and potentially maybe jet lagged in between, but you don't appear to be. You appear to be so bright. It's lovely always to have you at the Metta Center. So thank you again so much for your time today, for your sharing and your patience in answering our questions. I'm now going to hand over to Sophia so she can continue on with the emceeing.
Thank you so much, Tina. And thank you, Ayya, so much for the talk, the conversation, more like, everything Tina said. And I feel like this is a very important topic that doesn't get talked about enough. And so thank you for clarifying all those questions for us. Before we close off, we'd like to invite you for either a closing, a dedication of merits, or prayer, whichever you're comfortable with.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's lovely meeting you, Sophie. And thank you for Tina and Sinsin for organizing, and for all of you to join in and practice together. It's been quite lovely. So maybe you can share the merits with the devas. That way you can always use some deva help in guiding us. So if you know the chant, you're welcome to also chant with me. Akasata chabummata devanaga mahidika punyantam anumoditva chiram rakantu lokasasanam. Akasata chabummata devanaga mahidika punyantam anumoditva Chiram rakantu dhammadesanam. Akasata chabumata devanaga mahidika punyantam manumoditva chiram rakantu mam param. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Y'all be well, happy and peaceful. May all good things come to you.
Thank you. Same to you, Ayya.
Thank
right.
you. Thank you so much, Ayya. And thank you everyone for joining us today again. Yeah, sharing your questions and presence and everything. So before we close off, just a few quick announcements as always. Next Wednesday, we will start our urban retreat, The Path to Awakening with Venerable Dr. Kendana. And that's the first part of a longer retreat on the 22nd and 23rd of April, 9:30 to 5 p.m. So we'd love for you to be able to join us in person if you can, but they will also be recorded online. And as always, if you wish to subscribe to our emailing list or join our WhatsApp group, it's in the chat. And our events are purely run based on donations. So if you'd like to support our events and our center, please feel free to donate as well. The details are in the chat as well. Thank you again, Ayya, for joining us and giving us this talk. And thank you, Cynthia and Tina, everyone who made this happen. And thank you everyone for attending. Hope everyone has a lovely night.